So tonight, we're going to kick off these art talks with a conversation about a book that some have called the most dangerous book in Dallas's history. But if you've read the book, and for a long time it was extremely difficult to read because it was extremely difficult to get your hands on it, you'll find very quickly it's not a dangerous book at all. It's one of the most illuminating stories about the history of our city, and one in which we hope more and more people will read so that they can truly understand the totality of Dallas history, specifically as it relates to race relations. But perhaps more than any other reason, people should read this book, The Accommodation. It's because of what it can do for us in the future. Because we know when we learn the history, like in The Accommodation, and like what you just learned today with this exhibit, you are now equipped to do something about what you have learned. So thank you all for coming to the exhibit, for supporting the Latino Arts Project, and thank you specifically for coming to this talk.
I came to Dallas in 1978 in my very early 30s from Detroit, where I'd been a reporter for 10 years. After I'd been here about 6 years, I was writing a column for the Dallas Times-Herald, a daily newspaper which doesn't exist anymore, about City Hall. A local publisher, Taylor Publishing, wanted me to write a book about the city's racial history. If there was a reason for writing it, it was, and this is interesting in today's context, it was that white Dallas said the city didn't have any racial history. That nothing had ever happened here, and the city was divided north and south by race, with the money pushed up north, poverty south. That was a coincidence. And that was just how people liked it, and there had never been trouble here. So that seemed like a story that couldn't be true. I spent a couple of years researching it. I'm a journalist, not a historian. I owe a great debt of gratitude to the research librarians at the Dallas Central Library, and to a couple other professional historians who were working on books at that same time in the writing room at the Dallas and Texas collection at the library, and they steered me to really excellent primary sources, things I wouldn't have found on my own. So the story I found was the opposite of the white story about Dallas. Dallas and Texas have a long, sometimes heroic history, mainly painful and awful history of race. Dallas is a city built on cotton, to some extent pre-Civil War slavery cotton, but more post-Civil War cotton. There are sociologists and historians who will argue that slavery in Texas didn't end with the Civil War, that the planters here used a system called debt peonage and a draconian law enforcement system and prison system to hold black families on the plantations after the Civil War up into the 1930s and 40s, when cotton sort of moved west, and those families then moved into the cities, but they were only able to get off the plantations when the plantations pushed them out. In the 1950s, for a city that has no racial history and never had any trouble, there was a series of dynamite bombings of black families who were moving into white neighborhoods. There was a year-long investigation of the bombings by a so-called blue ribbon grand jury, and at the end of that year, the grand jury issued a report and said, we know who was behind the bombings. They said the responsibility for the bombings reached into, quote, unbelievable places. They named white religious organizations as having funded the bombings. White religious organizations involved in bombings is the city's KKK history. The city was run by the Ku Klux Klan into the 20s for the better part of a half century. The Ku Klux Klan was sort of driven underground, had to take off their robes and stop using that name. But, you know, we have freeways in this city named after high Klan officials to this day. And the bombings funded by, quote, white religious groups, that was the hand of the Klan coming forward in the 50s to try to drive black families out of white neighborhoods. So anyway, I wrote this book, told this story. The publisher, my editor was a guy named Bobby Frazee. He kept calling me up and saying, we got to get this thing on the street. There's trouble, and we've got to get it. He kept moving up my deadline, but he wouldn't tell me what the trouble was. Finally, he said, we made it. We've got the page plates on the presses, and Monday morning the presses roll and the book's going to be produced. That Monday morning, Bobby called me almost in tears and said they're out there in the shop now ripping the page plates off the presses. They've killed the book. And he wouldn't tell me why or how. He was trying to hang on to his job. He was not successful in doing that. I'm sorry to say, he was a good guy. But I knew the head of the CEO of the Dallas Citizens Council, the Dallas Citizens Council being an all-powerful business leadership group at that time. And their CEO was a guy, an attorney named Alex Bickley. We were not buddies, but we talked because I was a newspaper columnist. He returned my calls. And I called him up and said, Alex, did you kill my book? And he kind of went, damn straight. And he wanted to get credit for it. I said, why did you kill it? And I remember his words so clearly. He said, Jim, you are a Yankee, hippie, commie, pinko from Detroit. Now, Detroit was the worst part. And y'all had a bunch of mess up there, riots and so on. We've never had a speck of trouble. And so you want to come down here and stir things up because you're envious of us, because we've kept the lid on, things under control. I said, Alex, it's a history book. How does it stir things up? He said, oh, don't give me that. He said, you want all of his phrase, which I'll repeat once, our colored people, by which he meant black Southern Dallas. You want black Southern Dallas to read all this stuff and have a riot. And I said, Alex, who do you think my main sources were? They're all black Southern Dallas. Do you think black Southern Dallas forgot that you bombed them? Do you think they forgot about the Klan and all this stuff? They told me, they steered me to the stuff. So as we talked, and this brings me so much to today, the critical race theory stuff and what's going on in Florida, he wouldn't say it explicitly, but the people he didn't want to have read the book were white people. He knew black people knew this history. But for some reason, and to this day, I'm not smart enough to explain this exactly. But it was so important for him, for white people, not to read the history of white people. The book was eventually printed by another publisher. It was well read in Southern Dallas, kind of by Southern Dallas black intelligentsia, you know, academics, business leaders, clergy. It was not read at all in white North Dallas, except my mother read it, and she said it deserved a Pulitzer Prize, which I'm still waiting for. I found it in one white bookstore at North Park, and it was in the travel section. And the manager was there, and I said, well, why have you got this book in the travel section? And he said, well, it's something about accommodations. And when I told him what it was really about, he pulled the books off the shelves in front of me and said, we don't need a book like this in North Park. So it sort of sank beneath the waves and was forgotten.
Let's pause there before we bring it back. I want to understand, so the full title of the book, and please correct me if I'm wrong, The Accommodation, The Politics of Race in an American City. Roughly, that's what it is. You could have named this book anything, but you were deliberate in choosing the words, the accommodation. You have already stated that to some, there may have been an interpretation and understanding that the civil rights movement missed Dallas. Upon reflection and upon, even in your writing, you know that wasn't completely the case. But to some extent, it certainly wasn't Selma. It wasn't Birmingham.
Right.
We didn't see those, it wasn't Memphis, we didn't see those things. What was the what motivated the choice of that word, those words, for the title of the book?
There were a couple of things. One was that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference under Martin Luther King Jr. made a tactical decision not to come here. There were various reasons for that. There was a split in the black church. The King family, MLK Jr. and his father, were leaders of the assimilationist wing, which we would call integrationist now. There was another wing of the church that said, we're not interested in living with white people and assimilating. And that more separatist wing was really almost headquartered here in black clergy. Southern Dallas has always had less of an appetite for aggressive measures of integration than some other parts of the country and other cities, and that's reflected in the history of the civil rights movement. The thing is, the evils of racism were the same here. And black people weren't any happier here about it than anywhere else. And they were out on their porches with shotguns, waiting for the bombers to show up. It's a mistake to think that, the white story was here that black people here really like separation and segregation, and they like us. Well, black people here were happy with the separation, but they didn't like, they weren't happy with the white leadership. So that gets tricky. There was a key point when this investigation of the bombings was made public, and they said, we know who did it, and we could get more evidence and indict them. We're not going to. They will not be named. You'll never find out who they are, but we've put a stop to it. We have our thumb on this element, which would be this is the rich, powerful white business leadership telling the more working class KKK element, cut out the bombings. And they said, so we've told them to cut it out, we have our thumb on it, so it's over. Of course, thumb on it means you can take the thumb off if things change. But the line was, you don't have to worry about, you, black Southern Dallas, don't have to worry about the bombings anymore, so shut up. That's it. And that clergy leadership in Southern Dallas, and there were other elements. The city also agreed to the development of a black middle and upper class neighborhood called Hamilton Park. And the leadership kind of said, okay, that's our deal. We keep the lid on for any kind of extremist activity, and you keep the lid on the KKK guys. We keep our extremists down, you keep your extremists down. And that was the accommodation.